right, so I realized a mistake that I made last week, which was to title last week's episode The Final Week, which if you read it, you would logically think this is the final week of this very, very long series. But I was obviously talking about Jesus's last week of life, certainly in Jerusalem. So I apologize for any confusion about that. And I think within a few seconds of listening, you would have realized that there was still another week to go, which is going to be this week. So again, I apologize for that. But here we are finally at the last week of what has been certainly the longest series that I've done. But hopefully it's been good. But we are definitely at the last week, and we're going to come to finally answer that question that we set out many, many weeks ago, which was what is going on with that sign above Jesus's head, which says that this is the King of the Jews. So when we finished last week, Jesus was about to be arrested. And the reasons for that were the perceived threat, not so much of Jesus himself. The reality was that Pilate, the high priest, that the Jewish leaders knew that Jesus wasn't himself a threat. They probably saw him as fairly harmless. By himself, he wasn't the problem. The problem was the people. The problem was the crowds of people who really did think that this might have been the Messiah. And what can potentially happen when you've got a mob of people who feel like that they've finally got someone to rally their cause. And this expectation of the Messiah that we've been talking about for quite a long time now, this could be the one. This could be the culmination of what we've been waiting for, not just for our lives, but for the generations before us. And so if this is the one, well, we're going to get behind him. We're going to, he's going to lead us to this great revolution where we're going to finally overthrow our oppressors, in this case, the Romans. And so the pieces are all in place for what could potentially be a very bloody riot, a very violent upheaval that would result in the death of many, many Jewish people at the hands of the Romans. And so we're at the Passover. It's a time of pilgrimage. There's more people in Jerusalem than there normally would be, multiples more than there normally would be. And there is a Roman presence. There are thousands of Roman troops who are there precisely for the potential riot that could happen if something was to spark. And so what very likely happened was that the chief priests probably held counsel with Pilate, and Pilate was probably leading this, saying, hey guys, what are you going to do about this? This could get very ugly. People are, there's probably a lot of stirring amongst the people. You better make sure that this stays in line because you don't want us Romans to be the ones to come in and have to do that. And so the Jews, particularly the high priest, Caiaphas, has this responsibility to keep the peace and maintain the tax income. Well, that's your job. Keeping the peace is your priority here. And so, well, do your job. Make sure that there is no riot, there's no insurrection, there's nothing here in that could come as a result of him being here. So we saw that last week, and where that sort of comes to a head is a decision that is made by the Sanhedrin that Jesus has to die. We don't want what could potentially happen, and so we need to deal with this. And the simplest way for that to happen is to cut off the head, to cut off the potential spark for what could be this problem. And again, Jesus himself was harmless. They knew that he himself wasn't even wanting this. They understood who he was, but it was the threat of the people. And so they consult together, and they decide that number one, they feared the people. And Luke tells us this, that when they got together, they were looking for ways to put Jesus to death, not because of him personally, but because they feared the people and their response. And so what they sort of conclude, and this is sort of Annas, the father-in-law of the current high priest Caiaphas, his sort of sage advice is that it's better for one man to die than for the whole nation to be destroyed. So it's a simple logic, and put in that situation, it's an unfortunate situation, but it is the most straightforward way to address this. And so they decide that Jesus has to be executed. So what I want to do is to look then at the various accounts that we have. And there's a lot of detail in the Gospels about this particular night and the events that took place, because it is the pivotal story of Jesus' life, and the crucifixion is the central piece of the Christian faith. And so there's a lot of information that we have with regard to it. And so what I want to do is sort of combine the various accounts to sort of hopefully come up with a bit of a reconstruction of what took place during the arrest and the trial. And so we read, first of all, in Matthew 26, that they arrested Jesus by night. And so Jesus is out praying in the garden with his disciples. They've had their last meal together. Jesus has told them again that he's going to be taken from them. And it's all very depressing. It's all a very sad moment. And then the guards come out that have been sent out by the Sanhedrin in order to arrest him. And so they come by night, and they don't give the reasons why, but it would make sense that you're not going to arrest him in the middle of the day in the middle of Jerusalem. That has a lot of potential to spark the very thing that they don't want to have happen. You don't want to make a martyr out of Jesus. They're going to, but they want to minimize the impact that his arrest might have. Better to arrest him in the middle of the night, maybe with his close disciples there, sure, but at least not with crowds of people who could potentially riot. So they do it at nighttime and they arrest him, and then they bring him back to the Sanhedrin, or they bring him back to a gathering of the Sanhedrin. It's not an official meeting. It's just a gathering of probably not even the whole group, but probably the most vehement opponents of Jesus get together in order to figure out what to do next. Now, it's important to note that what happens here is not a formal trial. There's no official or legal consequences that can come from this. What they're doing is they're deliberating. They're trying to figure out what are the charges that we can bring against Jesus. So it's an initial interrogation before they actually bring him to the authority, which in this case is Pilate. Now, the timing of all of this is perfect because Pilate's in town. Pilate has come down with his troops to make sure that Jerusalem doesn't turn into a riot. And so he's going to be in town for that reason. Normally he's back in Caesarea. So the timing of all of this is perfect because it means that you've got the people that can actually do something about this, which is the Romans. They're actually in town. That's what we need. We need to get this done quickly. We don't want to have a trial, or we don't want to have Jesus being arrested waiting for Pilate to come and see him, because the way that it would work would be it was the governor's job to deal with capital cases. And so only the governor could do that. And so part of his job was to travel around the region and deal with these cases. Now, in the meantime, if somebody's been arrested and they're waiting to stand trial before the governor, they have to wait in prison. They have to wait, for however long it's going to take in some sort of prison. We see this later on with Paul waiting to see the emperor. He's in prison, not because that's his punishment, that's a holding place for him until he can get his opportunity to see Nero. So prison in the ancient world, it's used for that reason. Prison itself isn't the punishment. It's a place to keep people from running away until they can have their day in court. And so naturally, they want to get this done quickly. They want to avoid any of this. And if Jesus is just arrested and waiting. So anyway, the fact that Pilate is there is important because it means that, again, we can get this job done very quickly. And what they've probably schemed is that we're going to do this first thing in the morning, as soon as we possibly can, because we don't want to do it in the middle of the day. We don't want to do it at a point where the crowd is at its peak and where it could cause potential upheaval. We want to minimize all of this. And so probably what they had determined was, if we can get this done first thing in the morning before all the pilgrims start to wake up and start to get back into the city, what we would hope for them to see on their way into the city is Jesus crucified, and go, what happened? And not actually see the event take place, but just to come and see the result of it. So get it done as soon as possible. But in order for that to happen, we need something to charge Jesus with. We can't go to Pilate with nothing. We can't just go, we just don't like this guy. Now, the reality was, again, Pilate knew about Jesus. As much as the high priest knew about him, Pilate knew about him as well. Pilate would have had his spies all through the land. He would have been scheming with the high priest in order to sort of bring about Jesus' execution. All of that would have been in place. But we need grounds. We can't just go, we killed him because we didn't like him. We need to make this formal. And in particular, what the Jewish authorities need in order to do this properly is grounds on which to execute this potential Messiah. People think he's the Messiah. And if they are attached to, if they're associated with his death, then that's not going to look good for them. That's not going to end well for them in their authority. So they need to make sure that Jesus is fully discredited. They need to make sure that the people, when they inquire about it, realize, actually, no, he was never the Messiah, and so this execution is actually justified. And so they need those grounds to be able to go back to their own people in order to be able to point out, hey, this guy was not the one you thought he was, and that's why he needed to be executed. In fact, he's an apostate, and that's why he ended the way that he did. So that's what they're trying to work out during this inquiry. So it is an inquiry. It's a pre-trial sort of interrogation to have something to bring to Pilate. Now, it is interesting that in doing this procedure, again, it's not a formal procedure, but there were certain rules within sort of the Jewish legal system which sort of mitigated or sort of guided the way that they do their criminal proceedings. The Jewish law is very much focused on mercy. And in an ancient context, it really is very merciful. The goal of the Jewish law is to be a reflection of the mercy of God. God is a merciful God, and so we need a legal system that reflects that. And so whatever you want to read about the Old Testament, what you have to recognize is that the goal of Jewish law is to, in any way possible, bring about the acquittal of the person on trial. So this is his primary focus. And so what we sort of find later on in our sort of rabbinic sources are some of these rules regarding criminal proceedings. And one of them in particular relates to the time in which a trial can take place. And so it actually says here in these laws, the capital cases or capital trials could only take place during the day and not on the eve of the Sabbath or the day before a festival, which is exactly where we are. We're in the middle of the night right before a festival, which is precisely the time when these things couldn't take place. And so if they were trying to sort of uphold their own rules around this, well, then they've already started to break them in doing this. So they have this pre-trial hearing, and what they're trying to do again is to find grounds for Jesus' execution. And so what I want to read out then is the just sort of chunks of scripture that sort of indicate what actually took place. And so Matthew 26, it says this, that the chief priests and the whole Sanhedrin were looking for false evidence against Jesus so that they could put him to death. But they did not find any, though many false witnesses came forward. Now, of course, we need to be careful with our sources, that the gospel authors sort of have their own agenda. And by stating here that they're looking for false evidence, well, they probably were looking for anything they could cling to, anything that has a grain of credibility in order to be able to bring that against Jesus. And so if that's sort of, take it with a grain of salt sort of evidence, well, if we can use it, we're going to use it. Now, again, if we put that against Jewish law itself, what we read is that guilt can only be proved by two trustworthy witnesses and before a competent tribunal. So we need to have trustworthy witnesses, and what seems to be happening is that we've got a whole bunch of false witnesses. We've got people that are coming in and they're sort of, well, I heard from a friend of a friend of a friend these things that Jesus might have said, and it's like, well, that'll do. That's the sort of evidence. Anything that might, let's throw as much mud as we can against the wall and let's see what sticks. Well, that'll do. But again, what we need, what is required in a Jewish court is trustworthy witnesses, people that are credible, whose witness or whose testimony would actually stand up to proper scrutiny, because what we don't want is to railroad somebody into a false accusation. We don't want to punish a person who is actually innocent, but we've made them guilty by this false accusation. So this is what we're trying to avoid, but that seems to be precisely what we're finding in Jesus' trial. Now, it's very important in Jewish law that we have two witnesses, and this goes back to Deuteronomy. We need to have two trustworthy witnesses, people that both can corroborate what either one saw, because you don't want to go off the testimony of one person, because one person can, make stories up, but two people are less likely to do that. So we need at least two, but ideally more witnesses, so that we can get, at the very least, more of an unbiased account. We can get more of a verifiable account of what actually took place. And so what we find then are these two witnesses that do come forward. And again, we read about this in Matthew. It says, finally two came forward and declared, this fellow said, I am able to destroy the temple and rebuild it in 3 days. Then the high priest stood up and said to Jesus, are you not going to answer? What is this testimony that these men are bringing against you? But Jesus remained silent. Now, in Mark's account of that, Matthew takes the account from Mark. We'll come back to that in another series. But what Mark specifies is that even their testimony doesn't agree. Now, this comes back to what we talked about last week when Jesus was at the temple and he's turning over the tables, and when they come up to him and they say, hey man, what are you doing this for? Like, what justification or what authority do you have to destroy the temple the way that you are? Jesus says, I'm going to tear this thing down in 3 days and then rebuild it. Now, you can read that one of two ways. You can read that as a crazy person saying, I'm going to tear down this enormous structure in 3 days and then rebuild it myself with my own hands. That's how you should take it, because that's what a crazy person would say, because what he's saying is absolutely impossible. Or you could take it as a political threat, which is what they have maybe disingenuously done, is to take it as a political threat, which, it was. It was an attack. It was a threat against the temple, which is the political body, the political institution of the people of God, both spiritual and political. It was the most important institution in the life of the Jewish world. And so to threaten that is, it's a threat against the state. That's treason. That's the worst possible crime that you can commit in the ancient world. So that's how they've intentionally taken it, as a political threat. Jesus is challenging their authority and all of the implications of that. Now, of course, their testimony didn't line up. It didn't corroborate, because it's coming from people who are hearing it secondhand. It's a friend of mine read it on Facebook, and it's that sort of testimony that we're dealing with. Now, again, this is a really important point, because it cuts against what the requirement was, the expectation was for these sorts of trials. So what we find out from Jewish law later on is that all evidence must be direct and not circumstantial or presumptive. It must be, and then again, a person can only be sentenced to corporal punishment if all witnesses agree to one and the same thing, and that they saw one another while seeing the person engaged in the act. So you have to, for these witnesses to be credible, one, they have to tell the same story, and they have to have both seen each other while they both saw the event take place, and it'll have at least two people who can state that. And from what we gather from our Gospels is that that's just not the case here. What we've got of people who probably didn't see it and couldn't even agree on the details, even though it only happened a few days ago. So this wasn't like an old event that, time might have forgotten. No, it happened just a couple of days ago. So we can't even find that. We can't even find corroborating testimony. But nevertheless, that is a serious threat. That's something that if we can make that mud stick, that is going to definitely work in our favor in terms of our ability to execute Jesus. And then in Matthew 26:63, the high priest, the Sanhedrin's getting quite frustrated. Jesus isn't talking to them. He's not answering any questions. He's remaining silent throughout all of this. And eventually, through their frustration, just trying to find something that they can use against him, eventually they say to him, or the high priest says to him, I charge you under oath by the living God, tell us if you are the Messiah, the Son of God. Now, again, comparing this to Jewish law, not only is self-condemnation never extorted from the defendant by means of torture, but no attempt is ever made to lead them on to self-incrimination. So you can't coerce a person to admit guilt because, it's untrustworthy and it's wrong. And so we can't do that. And so by doing this, by saying, tell us plainly, are you the thing that we are charging you with, you're violating your own laws in doing that. Again, this isn't a formal trial, but this is trying to get some sort of grounds to be able to take him to Pilate. Nevertheless, the way that they're going about it is in violation of their own practices and procedures. So it's at this point that Jesus actually responds. This is what the core of the issue is. Are you the Messiah? Are you the one that everybody says that you are? And if that's the case, then we've got something. We've got grounds on which that we can actually go back to the people and say, no, he actually wasn't. He said he was, but actually, no, we can prove that he wasn't. So Jesus turns around and he says to them, you have said so. Jesus replied, "But I say to all of you, from now on you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of the Mighty One and coming on the clouds of heaven." Then the high priest tore his clothes and said, "He has spoken blasphemy. Why do we need any more witnesses? Look, now you have heard the blasphemy." Now, from a legal point of view, again, they violated their own rules. A voluntary confession on his part is not admitted in evidence and therefore not competent to convict him unless a legal number of witnesses minutely corroborate his self-accusation. So you can't take even into consideration self-testimony, self-accusation, unless others can verify it. We need witnesses. This is the point. We need people that can verify what this charge actually is. And so they've drawn this out of Jesus. They've compelled him. They've put him on the spot, painted him to a corner, said, "You have to get out. The only way you're going to get out of this is by telling us what we want to hear." And so Jesus doesn't actually directly answer the question. He says, "You guys, you have said so. You're the ones who've said that about me. I never said that. You're the ones that are saying that." But he does then quote Daniel. He does quote sort of apocryphal literature, which talks about, or which in its context is talking about the returning Messiah. So he's saying, "I'm going to come down, the Son of Man's going to come down on clouds." That is a prophecy about the coming Messiah. And so what Jesus is saying is that I'm that person. And so in a sense, he is admitting to that, but not directly. He's not saying to them what they want to hear, which is, "Yes, I am claiming to be the Messiah. What are you going to do about it?" That's not what he's doing. But nevertheless, they've got enough. And so the high priest tears his clothes, a sign of sort of contrition and a sign of his anger. And he says, "What else do we need to hear? We've got what we wanted, which is blasphemy." That's what we've been looking for. That's what all of this has been about. We've got him on the very thing that we need, which is, again, that he is an apostate, that he's committed blasphemy. Now, here's an important question that we need to ask ourselves. Why would Pilate care about blasphemy? Why would Pilate care about somebody who's saying, "Oh, I am a Messiah"? Now, you can say, well, if he's being technical about it, this is somebody who is admitting to being an insurrectionist because there is only one king, and which is Caesar, and to claim to be a god, well, the Son of God is the emperor. So you can make that case. But when you look at the reality of the situation, this is not something we should take seriously. Somebody who's claiming to be Messiah, there's plenty of Jewish people who've called themselves Messiahs, and that hasn't ended well. This is just another one of those instances. We can just as easily overlook this. So why would they talk about blasphemy? Why would that be a concern for Pilate? Well, the reality was this wasn't for Pilate. And we're going to see that in just a moment. This wasn't about Pilate. This wasn't about having grounds to be able to bring him on trial to the Romans. The Romans have already sort of figured out what's going to happen. We're going to see that later on. What this is about is the Jewish people. This is about discrediting Jesus. This is about pointing out to the people that this man claims to be the Son of God, claims to be the Messiah. He's a fake, he's a fraud Messiah, and that's why we had to bring him to the Romans to deal with. This is why we had to execute him. We've done you the favor here, people. So, you're welcome. Don't get angry with us. Actually, you're welcome. We've done you the favor. So this is about, in a sense, vindicating themselves to the people so that when they do eventually come out and see Jesus hanging on a cross, they're going to be able to say to him, this was a false Messiah, this was a false Christ that is hanging up here, and that's why he's ended up here. And so the morning rolls around, and now it's time for the proper trial. This is where things are actually going to happen. Again, remembering that all of this was about having something to be able to take to the people, but also having some sort of grounds to be able to have, we need Pilate, we need your help here in dealing with this guy. And so in the morning, they bring him to Pilate. And so you have to picture this as probably early morning, probably at sunrise, and remembering that Pilate lives next to the temple. He's actually not far from where they are. It's just a very, very short walk, maybe a few hundred meters to where Pilate is. And so they take him over to Pilate's barracks. And now I can imagine Pilate's probably out there. It's an early morning. He's probably got his paper, probably got a coffee, and he's just, looking ahead to what is hopefully going to be a peaceful day. And here are the Jews bringing Jesus up. And he just knows that his day is about to get really, really, really bad. Because there is a sense in which there is a concern that Pilate is going to have have here, even though, again, Pilate doesn't see Jesus himself as a threat. Pilate knows that Jesus is basically harmless, but there is always going to be a concern about the people. Now, the Romans are there precisely to put down any sort of rebellion, put down any sort of uprising that might occur amongst the people, but that's still going to be very violent. That's still going to look very bad on Pilate's record. That is not what you want to have happen. And so you want to avoid that. And the reality is that if this goes south, if this goes sideways in any way, the people may do that. That is always going to be a risk when you execute what is potentially a martyr, and could be made that way. So he's got that hanging over him, that if this doesn't go well, then he's going to have a riot on his hands, and his troops are going to have to crush that. On the other hand, if he doesn't do anything about this, if he lets Jesus go, then he's got the Jewish authorities that are going to turn against him. They already don't like Pilate. They don't like any of the Romans, but they can at least work with Pilate because he gives them the favors of their important positions, particularly the high priest. And so he doesn't want to have those guys offside at the same time because he needs them to rule the people. He needs those people on his side working for him so that they can do the work of keeping the peace and collecting the taxes. So it's really a case of you're damned if you do and you're damned if you don't. He really doesn't, there's no good potential outcome. Now, the only hopeful outcome is that he goes ahead with the execution and nothing comes of it. Now, as we know from the story, that's exactly how it unfolded. Nothing else comes of this. Jesus is crucified and everybody just goes, wow, let's just go about their day. But he doesn't know that yet. So he's going to be carrying this. He's going to have this fear and trepidation of what could happen either way in these circumstances. So anyway, they bring him up to Pilate. Now, remembering what they've just found Jesus guilty of is blasphemy. But why would Pilate care about blasphemy? That's a Jewish issue. That's a local issue. And as far as the Romans are concerned, one, it's not even a crime. And number two, it's certainly not something to punish a person over. And so they've got this charge against Jesus, but again, that's for the people. That's so that they can go back to their own people and say, this is what we found him guilty of. He's not the Messiah. He's a fraud. He's an apostate. And we know this because when they bring Jesus to Pilate, look at what they say. They say, we found this man misleading our nation and forbidding us to give tribute to Caesar and saying that he himself is Christ, a king. Now, what are the two things that Pilate is only concerned about? Keeping the peace, paying the taxes. And in terms of the high priest, his job is keep the peace, collect the taxes. That's their two jobs. And anything that is a threat to that needs to be stopped. Any sort of insurrection or any sort of failure to pay tribute, both of those things are treasonous. Both of those things are high crimes. And those are the sort of things that are going to get you executed. And so they've got Jesus on blasphemy, but what they bring him to Pilate with are the two things that an actual Roman governor is going to be most concerned about. And so the first thing they say is that he's misleading our nation and forbidding us to give tribute to Caesar. Now, what's this referring back to? Well, this comes back to the argument that Jesus had a few days ago, which is it right to pay taxes to Caesar, yes or no? And Jesus kind of obfuscates his way through the answer, but there's enough maybe in that if you want to manipulate it and, just twist the story a little bit to make it seem like actually that's Jesus saying, no, don't pay your taxes. So they've got him. If they really wanted to manipulate the evidence, they might be able to have something, but really there's nothing there to make stick. But nevertheless, that's what they're trying to pin on Jesus. And then he's saying that he himself is Christ, which Pilate, you wouldn't realize that this word Christos for us means the anointed one, which is to say he's in the line of David, or he's claiming to be in the line of David, which means that he's the returning king. That's what he's actually saying there. So let's put that into language in terms you'll understand, which is you know what a king is and you know what sort of a threat that is. That's a direct challenge to the emperor, who's also God, but is certainly the king. So that's treason, right? That's insurrection. That's not keeping the peace. That is in direct contradiction to the emperor himself. So these are the two things that Pilate is going to be most concerned about, and these are the things that they're trying to sort of slap onto Jesus, try to make him guilty of. Now, number one, he never said, don't pay taxes to Caesar. He obfuscated his way through it. But if we twist it enough, we can maybe make him guilty of that nevertheless. And he never said that he was Christ. The people said that he was Christ. He never said that. And in fact, when they asked him a few hours ago, he said, you say that about me. Now, then he sort of talks about sort of vague apocalyptic language, but never actually himself says that. That's what they have sort of placed on him. But nevertheless, there's enough in here to be able to bring that to Pilate and say, if you're going to kill him, like we've discussed, we've got good enough grounds for you to do that. And so everything seems to be in place. Now, again, for Pilate, I can only imagine that he has got at least some trepidation about what could happen, but nevertheless, we need to act, and that's what we're about to see. So then in John, we sort of see Pilate trying to do his best to kind of get out of the situation if it's possible, if there's any last chance that he might have to sort of weasel his way out of this and not have to bear the repercussions of this. So in John 18, it says, Pilate says to them, take him yourself and judge him by your own law. But then the people, the Jewish authorities respond and they say it's not lawful for us to put anyone to death. So here's the conundrum. Only Pilate has the power to execute a criminal. Only Pilate can deal with a capital case. So Pilate is the only one that can do in this situation what it is that the people want, which is to have Jesus executed. But Pilate at the same time knows what that means. You know, when you execute somebody, it can have ramifications. Now, the reality was Romans executed provincial people all the time. That's a pretty standard practice, but you've still got to be careful about that, particularly when it comes to somebody who is so popular and somebody who is so potentially volatile, or at least the people that look up to him are so potentially volatile. And so then in Luke's account, we have sort of this additional thing that they throw out to Pilate, and they say he stirs up the people, teaching throughout all Judea, from Galilee even to this place. Now, this is a really interesting twist to the story, because if you remember, and we talked a lot about the political situation that's going on in the land at the time. In the south, you've got Judea, which is ruled by a Roman governor. But in the north, in Galilee, where Jesus comes from, it's all part of the Roman Empire, but it's not a Roman province. That's ruled by Herod, by Herod Antipas. So he's the one who's responsible in this case for Jesus. It's not Pilate. Pilate oversees the people of Judea, and then he does that through the high priest. In Galilee, that's a completely different district. This is the difference between, really Australia and New Zealand, right? They're two completely different jurisdictions, two completely different places, both with their own sets of laws and all the rest of it. So this isn't Pilate's problem. Pilate isn't the one that has to deal with this necessarily. Even though, yes, Jesus is in Jerusalem, he's still a Galilean, and so should be tried at least in Galilee and certainly by Herod. Now, what's really interesting, again, is that, well, Herod's in town. Herod even has his own palace. His dad built a palace in the middle of Jerusalem, and so he's got his own place to stay. And of course, Herod is going to be in town because it's the Passover. Everybody's in Jerusalem. That's where they'll all come from. It'll come down too. And so Herod is going to be in town as well. And so he has them take Jesus down to Herod, and maybe Herod will deal with this. Now, Herod faces the same conundrum, only that if he kills Jesus, well, number one, he's got potentially the Judean people who are ready to maybe support Jesus as the Messiah. That's still going to be a problem. But he then has to go home, and the people that live back in Galilee are the family and friends of Jesus. And so that's not going to work out well for him either if he goes ahead and does this. And so Herod knows this. He doesn't want a bar of this. He doesn't want all the political fallout that might come as a result of this. And so again, he does what Pilate does, which is try to get himself out of this. And so we find Herod joking around, making a few, mocking Jesus and all the rest of it, but ultimately just obfuscating and eventually just sending him back to Pilate. Now, again, I can imagine Pilate at this point just going, oh man, Herod, you had one job to do, and yet he sees Jesus walking up the street again. And so Pilate realizes he's got to have to do something. He's got to, again, damned if you do, damned if you don't, but you're going to have to do something. And so the authorities, they turn back to Pilate and they play their final trump card, and they say, if you release this man, you are not Caesar's friend. Everyone who makes himself a king opposes Caesar. Now, you remember that the only reason Pilate is there in the first place is because of the emperor's favor. So Tiberius has appointed Pilate as the governor of the region, and he's only there on the good graces of Tiberius. And so if word gets back to Rome that Pilate has let go this potential insurrectionist, that's not going to work out for Pilate either. And that's going to, in fact, what they're really implying here is that if you let him go, what you're actually confirming is that you believe in what he's saying. He's saying he's the Messiah and you're letting him go. That means that's some sort of tacit endorsement of that message. Well, that in and of itself is treason. So you yourself will be guilty of treason. You'll certainly be no friend of Caesar because you're allowing somebody to claim the place of Caesar. So what are you going to do about that? Everyone who makes himself a king opposes Caesar. You're allowing this. That's what you're doing. How's that going to end for you, Pilate? So he knows that this isn't going to go away. He's going to have to be decisive with this circumstance. And so goes on in John, it says, when Pilate heard these words, he brought Jesus out and sat down on the judgment seat at a place called the Stone Pavement, and in Aramaic, Gabbatha. Now it was the day of preparation of the Passover. It was about the 6th hour. He said to the Jews, behold your king. They cried out, away with him, crucify him. Pilate said to them, shall I crucify your king? The chief priests answered, we have no king but Caesar. So he delivered them over to them to be crucified. This is insane. This is completely bananas. How these guys have responded. Think about everything we've been talking about over the last 14 weeks now, about how important it was for the Jewish people that God is their king. Yahweh is their only king. Going right back to the very beginning of their foundation, God was always going to be their king. And yet here they are in this moment saying, we've only got one king and his name is Caesar. I mean, you talk about betrayal. You talk about, just everything that is just so bad about that statement, and yet here they are in their desperation, even turning aside from Yahweh himself to say that even he's not our king. In this case, Caesar is our king. But yet out of the desperation, they get what they want. As we find out, Pilate hands Jesus over to be crucified. Now, just at this point, I should probably just throw out a bit of a warning. I'm going to talk about crucifixion. I'm going to spend a bit of time going into crucifixion itself. And this is pretty gory stuff. So if you are sensitive to this, just be aware that, please don't let that be a discouragement from listening, but really try to understand what crucifixion actually was, particularly when we sort of make it into something very beautiful. We wear crosses, we've got cross tattoos, it's kind of a symbol of our faith, and all of that is very true and very important. But it's not a beautiful thing, and this is the point of it. This is why it was so significant for Jesus to be crucified. So we're just going to talk about that for the last stage of this series. And again, just a bit of a warning for what that is. So just quickly to understand how crucifixion fits within the Roman world, and particularly within the legal structure of the Roman world. The priority of all of these communities, of all the ancient world, I've talked about this plenty of times before, the priority is always harmony, city harmony within families, harmony within cities, and particularly harmony within the empire. This is why rule number one of empire is keep the peace. If you're an insurrectionist, that's the highest form of treason. That's going to get you executed. And even if you're a Roman citizen, if you're found to be caught in treason, you're still going to get the same punishment as somebody who's not a citizen. So it's a very, very serious matter. And so that's the only crimes really that you'll ever be prosecuted for. Civil cases and even cases of murder can really be dealt with privately. That's something the two families can can work out between themselves. The real crimes that you're going to find in a Roman court are going to be related to civil matters. They're related to state matters because it's a crime against the state itself, not a crime against another individual, but a crime against the state. And so in those cases, that's when we're going to take things seriously, and that's when we're going to be punished for that. Now, we've talked before already about prison. Prison itself isn't a punishment. That doesn't come until much, much later on in history. Prison was just a place you held the person until they can go to trial, until they can actually deal with the matter then. But in most cases, what will happen is that the Roman governor will deal with a case then and there on the spot. And whatever punishment is required will be done on the spot, and then we get on with our day. We see this later on in Philippi when Paul and Silas are charged with effectively insurrection. They're punished on the spot and they're thrown in prison just to add to the humiliation. But otherwise, we've done the punishment then and there. So that's typically how the Romans are going to do this. Now, the worst form of punishment, obviously, is going to be crucifixion. This was the highest form of capital punishment, but what it sort of represents is this judicial system where if you are caught in a crime, there's only going to be two punishments that you can expect to receive. One is going to be pecuniary. In other words, you pay a fine. You're going to be fined for, if it's a minor crime, you pay a fine and you get on. But otherwise, it's going to be capital, right? You're going to be, at the very minimum, flogged. But generally what's going to happen, and certainly depending on your status, is that you're going to be executed. So execution is just an absolutely standard thing that's happening all the time, and it's just what people come to expect. It's what is just part of their everyday life, is seeing people executed left, right, and centre for any and every sort of crime. Now, where a distinction is made is in your status. If you're a high status person, if you're a wealthy person, and certainly if you're a Roman citizen, you're an honourable person, your punishment will always be less and it will always be more merciful than somebody who's the opposite. So if you're an honourable person, if you've committed a lesser crime, or if you generally a sort of a crime that is still serious, but maybe not necessarily worthy of a capital punishment, then your punishment will be exile. We'll give you the opportunity to flee. And typically what would happen in Rome is that even if you were charged with a capital crime and your sentence was going to be execution, generally what they'll do is they'll say, look, come back in a couple of days and we'll do the job, but because you're an elite, honourable, high-status person, we're going to give you a couple of days to get your affairs in order. Now, what the expectation at that point is that you're going to flee. You're going to leave the city. You're going to grab as much stuff as you can, and you're going to get the hell out of there, and we're just not going to chase you. We're just going to let you go. So long as you don't come back to Rome, you stay out of the city, that's going to be fine. And so typically what a lot of capital cases ended up with, again, certainly amongst the elites, those that had the resources to actually upheave themselves and to relocate somewhere else, what would typically be the result would be that they would go into self-exile. But even if it does come to them being executed, what that would typically look like would be something quick, something like strangulation or something like decapitation. That's typically how they're going to be executed, which is why when we read in church tradition, Paul was decapitated because he was a Roman citizen. He was a higher status person than somebody like Peter, who wasn't a citizen and we know was crucified. So that's going to be one of the key distinctions between a sort of a high status and low status person. But that's not what we're talking about here with Jesus. What we're talking about here is somebody who is low status, if only by virtue of being a provincial, somebody who's not a Roman citizen, somebody who's seen as lesser. So their punishment is going to be much harsher. And so whereas a high status person might be just given the opportunity to go into exile, a low status person will be sent to hard labor, go and work in a mine, turned into a slave, basically, and that's going to be your death sentence because nobody really survives in those conditions. So even for a lesser crime, you're going to get that. But for a more serious crime, the capital crimes, you're going to be executed, but in the most violent and in the most disgraceful way. So it could be things like you're fed to the animals or you're burnt alive. But typically what you're going to do for somebody is that you're going to crucify them. And that's the point. The idea of crucifixion is that it's not just about punishing you. It's not just about a creative way of executing you. It's to point out to everybody else, this is what happens when you do what this person did. So don't do what this person did because this is going to be your fate. So crucifixion itself is both a punishment and a sign. It's a warning to everybody else, again, don't do this thing that this person has done. So typically what crucifixion is going to be sort of reserved for is going to be slaves. It's going to be for the lowest status people. Slaves can always expect to be crucified if they disobey their master or do anything that is of any sort of criminal nature. They're going to be executed. They go by crucifixion. But also foreigners, criminals, robbers, people of low status, people that are just sort of the scum of the society. If they are caught, they're going to be crucified and certainly or executed in the most violent way, and ideally at the place where the crime happened. We catch you in the act somewhere, we're going to crucify you there, just as a permanent reminder to everybody walking past there, look what happens when somebody does this. So it's absolutely standard, and it basically just becomes the expectation for a slave. What is always hanging over them is the reality that they will probably end up on a cross if they do the slightest thing wrong. Going back to the whole issue of Philemon, Paul writing to Philemon on behalf of this slave Onesimus, what could have ended up with that situation is that Onesimus could have been crucified, and that would have been Philemon's prerogative as a slave master would have been to crucify him. So crucifixion is absolutely standard, typical form of execution, and every major city would have outside the city a place where this took place. So we read about Golgotha in Jerusalem. Again, every major city would have had a place outside the city where this would have been done. And you do this on a high point. You do this up on a hill so that everybody can see. And you do it near the main road. You do it in a place where everyone is going to see it. And we're going to leave that person up there for days or even weeks as a permanent reminder to everybody that this is what happens. It's a reminder of the power of Rome. We are here. Don't mess around with this because this is what's going to happen to you. So it's a signpost. Literally, it's a signpost. It's a stop sign along the road saying, stop, don't do this. That's what we're trying to point out to you here. And everybody would see this. Every citizen of the ancient world would have seen a crucifixion at some point in their life, including children. That children would have seen this as a part of their everyday life. So this is just what you come to expect. In the ancient world, in the Roman world, crucifixion is just an everyday part of society as everything else was. So the practice itself wasn't a Roman invention. The Romans didn't really invent anything, in fact. Apart from concrete, there really wasn't a lot that the Romans actually invented. They just kind of adopted all the best from all of the other surrounding peoples and kind of made their own versions of it. So Romans weren't typically original. They were pretty much plagiarists when it came to everything, including means of execution, like crucifixion. So crucifixion itself probably emerges with the Persian Empire. So we talked a long time ago about the Persians. They were the guys who probably came up with this. Now there was always the punishment of hanging a person up on a stake and leaving them there to die. Has always been around through ancient societies. Again, for the purposes of one, killing the person, but secondly as a warning sign. So the Persians certainly were one of the first ones to really sort of adapt this into their empire. And then others around them picked that up, including the Carthaginians. So the Carthaginians, that's another story, but the Carthaginians were the primary enemy of Rome very early on in their history. And the Carthaginians were a little bit different in that they would use crucifixion to punish their generals. Now, everyone who does something wrong in the Carthaginian Empire can potentially be crucified, but the fact that the Carthaginians actually used it for their military generals was interesting. What it was an incentive. Number one, if you want to be a general, you've got to understand what the stakes are, which is that if you lose a battle, or if it's seen that you're weak or you've done something that's egregious in your military position, we're going to crucify you. So number one, it makes sure that you don't get you get people who are really serious about doing the job, and there's always that threat that if you do the wrong thing, you're literally going to be crucified. So the Carthaginians did that. The Romans adopt it from the Carthaginians, and they certainly don't do it to their generals, but they really kind of amplify it. They really use it as their sort of standard way of dealing with the people, and certainly, as we see, to deal with their slaves. Now, in terms of the process, there's no standard process for crucifixion. What it simply comes down to is that you're nailed up to a tree or to a post. Now, what seems to be common through them is that there is a pre-torture. Generally, this is going to be a flogging. And these floggings can be so severe. Josephus talks about people being flogged to the point where you could see their internal organs, right? So typically what's going to happen is that the flogging itself is going to kill people. Very often those who are sentenced to crucifixion don't even make it to the cross because they've been flogged so severely that they just die from the blood loss and from the torture that has just happened to them. So that's sort of the preamble to the crucifixion itself. And then if you manage to survive the flogging, then you're going to carry the cross piece. So you're going to carry the patibulum, which is the piece that actually sort of goes, that's where you get your arms nailed to. And then you carry that to the place of the cross, and then you're nailed down to that. And of course, the nails go through the wrists. You might have seen the Passion of the Christ where they put nails through the hands. That's not going to work. The body weight's going to just rip the nails straight through your hands. So you're going to go through the wrists. Now, I've only ever heard this described, the pain of what that might be like, but it's described something as that if you imagine you hit your funny bone, you hit the nerves in your elbow, and it just sends that shock through your arm and through your body. That's a pretty excruciating momentary pain. The way they describe this, because there's so many nerves running through that part of your body going into your hands, it'd be something like taking that funny bone, that set of nerves, and crushing it with pliers. It would just be the most excruciating thing. And it's not just pain that just sort of goes away once the nail's in there. It's going to stay with you for the whole time that you'll hang in there. So this is absolutely extraordinary amounts of pain that you're going through there. And then they're going to nail your feet to the upright. And what that would probably look like, well, it could be a number of different ways, but generally it'll go through the side of the foot. They've actually found only two in all of the archaeological records. We've only got two pieces of archaeological evidence of a crucifixion. And both of these are nails going through ankle bones. Now, we don't have other evidence of it because typically what would happen is that the Romans would pull the nails out to get the body off and then probably reuse the nails. What we've got in these cases are ankle bones that have still got the nails in them. They've probably found heaps of bones that have been crucified but couldn't see the damage from the crucifixion, whereas this, we've got the nails in them. So only two. You can Google them and just to have a look. But you'll see that the nails are going through sort of through the side of the ankle, and so therefore probably nailing them maybe side on to the front of the post or maybe to the side. But either way, through the stronger bones there to hold them up. Now, in some cases, they might give you a seat. They might give you something to sit on, which is going to prolong the execution, because the way that you typically die, well, apart from just the exposure, the fact that you're hanging there naked on a cross, bleeding out from all of the torture that you've just been through, that's eventually going to kill you. The starvation and the dehydration and the exposure out into the elements, all of that's going to kill you, but it's going to do it it's going to do it slowly. But what probably is happening as you're dying is that the weight on your lungs is making it almost impossible to exhale air. So you're breathing in, but it's getting harder and harder to exhale. And so this is gradually wearing you down. It's just adding to the torture. But and because the reason for that, again, is because the weight of your body pulling down on your shoulders, pulling down on the nails. But if you're up on a seat, then we can prolong the torture. We can hold you up there for longer. You're seated up there and you're nailed to it. You can't get down. But now it's just about the exposure. Now it's about, well, at the very least, you've got a couple of days in you before you dehydrate. Now the dehydration is going to be exacerbated by the blood loss, but nevertheless, we can still hang you up there for quite a while. And so there's accounts of people hanging on these things for surviving for a couple of days, just very, very slowly, gradually, their life evaporating from them. But again, there's no standard way that this happens. And so we've got this sort of example from Seneca, this testimony from Seneca, where he says, I see crosses there, not just of one kind, but made in many different ways. Some have their victims with the head down to the ground, some impale their private parts, others stretch out their arms on the gibbet. So there was just no standard way to do this. It was just whatever takes your fancy at the time. The point is we're nailing you up to a high point and we're going to leave you there to die. And what that is really saying, the point of that is it's sort of it's a way of really adding to the mockery of the person. So typically what would happen is that a slave who has thought themselves bigger than their station, they've talked back to their master, for example, and tried to act like a free person. In other words, they've elevated themselves. Well, or an insurrectionist has elevated themselves above the state. What we're saying to you is, oh, we will elevate you. Yes, we will do the very thing that you're seeking to do, but then we're going to nail you up there. And we're going to make it very clear to everybody, this is what happens to anyone who tries to do this. So it's a deterrent. Again, it's a deterrent. Now we've got, and primarily for the provincials, you're not going to get a lot of crucifixion in Rome. You're certainly going to get it in a place like Judea, where you've got more likely finding people who are acting against the state, people who are more likely to be seditious. So we've got this horrific account from Josephus when he's talking about the eventual fall of Jerusalem in 70 and what the Romans did once they finally defeated the Jewish people, and when the temple got destroyed, this is the way that they dealt with them. So Josephus says they were first scourged and subjected to torture of every description before being killed and then crucified opposite the walls. Titus felt pity for them, 500 or sometimes more being captured every day, but their number was too great for him to risk either letting them go or putting them under guard. But his main reasons for not stopping the crucifixions was the hope that the spectacle might induce them to surrender. So in other words, we'll kill you, but hopefully that'll tell everybody else, hey, stop what it is that you're doing. For fear that continued resistance would involve them in a similar fate. So the soldiers, out of rage and hatred, nailed those they caught in different postures by way of jest, and so great was their number that space could not be found for the crosses, nor crosses for the bodies. So these soldiers have just been fighting against the Jewish rebels, and now they've caught them. They've either surrendered or they've caught these Jews, and now this is going to be a punishment to you. And just out of rage of everything that's been happening and the battles that have been taking place, we're going to make sure that you suffer the worst possible death imaginable. And so we're going to crucify you. We're going to do it in the most horrific way, as if it wasn't horrific enough, that we possibly can. And so there were so many of them being crucified, Josephus says, they couldn't even find enough timber to make crosses. There was just so many people being executed every day. But in the hope that by other rebels seeing this, that they'll go, yeah, you know what, let's put our swords down and let's give up this fight. So there's no standard way to do this. It's really up to the whims of the person who's doing it. And again, for the purposes of, well, hopefully for a deterrent. Now, other times it was done for entertainment. You could go to the theatre and you could see a crucifixion. They would do actual crucifixions in a theatre, in a stage play, rather than fake it, rather than just act it out. Let's do it for real. We've got to crucify this person anyway, so why don't we make a spectacle of that? And so you taking the family out to the movies, and what you're seeing right in front of you on the stage is this crucifixion. So horrendous. It's as bad as it could possibly get. And then once the person was dead, they'd leave them up there for a while, just depending on what sort of message they want to send. Sometimes the body would be rotted right away. They just let it just rot completely away. But eventually the body would be taken down and then they throw it in a pit. So they would just dispose of the body in some pit somewhere. The idea of that being that it just finishes off the insult. Not only have we crucified you, not only have we taken your body, stripped it naked and nailed it for public spectacle up on this cross, now we're not even going to give you the dignity of a burial. We own your body and we're going to throw it out into a pit for the animals to eat. And so vultures and dogs and hyenas and other animals are going to be coming along and they're going to be making a feast out of whatever is left of your body, just to add to the total stigma, to add to the total disgrace that we've just put you through. So it is absolutely the worst form of death ever devised by humanity. And this was very well known by the Romans themselves. It was the thing that they feared the most, was that could happen to me. I step out of line, either as a provincial or as a slave, and that's going to be my fate if I was to do that. So it's just standard sort of practice. But the most interesting thing about crucifixion is that you never talk about it. We actually don't know a lot about crucifixion. We've got very few accounts of it happening, even though it happened every single day. It was probably one of the most common things that happened in the Roman world, and yet we know almost nothing about it because nobody talked about it. It's like the worst form of disgusting crime that you can imagine today. We know it happens all the time, but we don't talk about it. It's not the subject of polite conversation. In fact, the word crux, the Latin word crux, which we get our word cross from, C-R-U-X, that's a 4-letter C word. Now, this is a G-rated, well, maybe not today, but this is generally a G-rated podcast. And so I can't give you the equivalent 4-letter C word that we might find in the English language. I'll let your imagination figure that out for yourself. But the word crux was a swear word along the lines of a 4-letter C word in the English language today. It's just not a word that you say. Certainly not in polite company. So you don't talk about it. You don't think about it. It's not something you're supposed to be confronted with. Certainly as a high status Roman citizen, even though it happens every day, it's not something that we talk about, which is really quite remarkable when you consider that only a few decades later, Paul's saying to the Corinthians, we preach the message of the cross. And he uses the word, the Greek equivalent stavros, but nevertheless, the point being, we preach this message of this, even this word that Romans don't want to talk about. This foolish, disgusting message, it absolutely was, because it was grounded in an idea, in a notion of, in a reality of crucifixion that we never want to talk about at all, and yet you celebrate it. You celebrate the fact that your Messiah was crucified. This is absolutely abhorrent. It's just absolutely disgusting, the very idea of this. So crucifixion is horrendous. Again, you cannot just fathom how terrible this whole thing is. So much so, in fact, that when the Roman Empire became Christian, Constantine, one of the first things that he did when he became emperor was to ban crucifixion. As a Christian, he said, we cannot tolerate this. We have to stop. Now, for centuries before that, there would be plenty of, or maybe some Roman moralists would say, hey, this is maybe going a bit too far. But they at the same time rationalize that if we take it away, then we're going to take away the disincentive we have over the people. So we don't necessarily like crucifixion happening and the fact that it happens, but if we don't do it, people are going to go crazy. People are going to be all sorts of rebellious. Constantine comes along and he says, no, this is a moral scourge. We have to stop this. And so it was the Christians' effect, or the Roman Empire becoming Christian, which is actually when we see this thing eventually sort of removed from practice. So I've taken a bit longer with this episode. We're just going to finish off in these last few minutes. Let's look at Jesus' crucifixion. Now, this is one of the historical facts that we have about Jesus. Whatever the Gospels, whatever you want to say about the validity of the Gospels and whatever else, we have other sources that testify to the fact that Jesus was crucified, that there was a man named Jesus and that he was crucified. And so we can rely on this fact. Josephus says, writing later on, he says, now there was about this time Jesus, a wise man, for he was a doer of wonderful works, a teacher of such men as received the truth with pleasure. He drew over to him both many of the Jews and many of the Gentiles. He was the Christ. And that's probably a later Christian addition. The important point from Josephus is what he says next, which is Pilate, at the suggestion of the principal men amongst us, had him condemned to the cross. So even Josephus himself later on is testifying to the reality, the existence of Jesus and the fact that he was crucified under Pilate. But then the Roman historian Tacitus, he says, Christus, from whom the name had its origin, suffered the extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius at the hands of one of our procurators, Pontius Pilate. So you've got Roman testimony too, as well, to the fact that Jesus existed, and what we do know about him with all certainty is that he was crucified. So we can say this with absolute confidence that Jesus certainly was crucified. And so what we find in Matthew's account then of the crucifixion is perfectly in keeping with what we find in everything we just talked about, in what we know about crucifixion. So Matthew 27, it says this, then the soldiers and the governor took Jesus into the governor's headquarters, and they gathered the whole battalion before him. And they stripped him, and they put a scarlet robe on him, and twisting together a crown of thorns, they put it on his head and put a reed in his right hand. And so you've got the standard practice of mockery. This is you're going to mock the person that you're about to execute. They flogged him. They're going to mock him, and they put this crown of thorns on his head. Now, symbolically, this is a really important point that they're doing here. What normally happens in the Greek games is that when you win the prize, when you win a competition, you win a crown. The crown is the supreme prize that you can win. And what the crown represents, the crown, say, if you win a crown at the Olympic Games, you won the Olympics, you win a crown. The crown itself is made of an olive wreath. It's made of a plant. The wreath itself will literally rot away because it's just, well, it's a plant, right? But the point is the honor. The point is you won that crown, which means you won the honor of being the winner of the Olympics. And so that is what you're getting through this. So again, the crown will rot away, but you'll always be remembered as the person that won it. And your family will take pride in the fact, your city will take pride in the fact that you are somebody that they relate to, that we know this person who won the Olympics. So the honor that comes along with that, this glory, the fame that goes along with that is going to last into eternity. That's what the point of winning these crowns is. So the fact that they put a crown on his head, but a crown of thorns, what is that? What are they saying here? Well, let's add to the shame. Oh, we're going to give you a crown. Oh, you're a king? Oh, we're going to give you a crown because, oh, great king, every great king needs a crown. So we're going to put a crown on you, but it's going to be made of thorns. It's going to be another form of torture. It's going to make you bleed. It's going to be the most disgraceful thing that you could ever wear. That's the point here. It's to add to the shame. It's to heighten the shame through what should be the most glorious thing you could receive, in fact, is demonstrating, or it's trying to bring about the highest or the worst shame that you could possibly experience. So it's a very calculated thing that they're doing here. It's not just some just spur of the moment thing, but they're really calculating the way that they're adding to the shame and humiliation that Jesus is going through. And so then kneeling before him, the story goes on, they mocked him, saying, "Hail, King of the Jews." And they spit on him and took a reed and struck him on the head. And when they had mocked him, they stripped him of the robe and they put his own clothes on him and they led him away to crucify him. Now, at this point, the story finishes up. They don't go into the detail of the crucifixion because everybody knows what they did next. They didn't have to be there to know what a crucifixion looks like because everybody who read these Gospels when they were first written understood what a crucifixion was. They had seen them themselves. And so they don't need to fill in the blanks of it because it's not a part of the story that needs to be told. But the fact is they crucified him, and that's the point that you need to know here. And this is the question we've been getting to this whole series. Because what they did next is they put a sign above his head. And what's the point of a sign above a person's head? Well, it's to show the crime. It is to point out to everybody looking on, because you might have a stranger who doesn't know. I mean, you've seen crucifixions all the time. You didn't see the trial. You don't know what this person's guilty of. Just in case you're not sure, you need to know what this person did that got them there. Not because we want to justify our behavior. We're not saying that this person was an insurrectionist and so this is why we did this. This is a justification for our behavior. No. It's a warning. Crucifixion was a warning. It was a message to everybody who's looking on. That's the point. It's about telling everybody else why this person is here. So the sign above the head will tell everybody what it is that this person has done. And so they come up with this idea. First of all, and we've already talked about this, is that they crucify him early in the morning. They get this thing done as soon as they can, and they want to get him up on that cross first thing in the morning so that as the pilgrims start to come into the city, they're going to be walking up the main road and they're going to be walking directly past Jesus's crucified body. Now, these crowds are still in the mindset that Jesus is potentially the Messiah. Maybe this is the day. We've seen what he's been doing all week. This could be the one. And so they're coming in with this expectation, this excitement, this buzzes in the air. This is going to be a Passover like never before. And this could be the day when the revolution begins and the Messiah comes and that we get the land back. I mean, there's so much excitement amongst the people. It's like this. It's like Christmas is here. We're finally going to get what we've been waiting for generations and generations. And so they're coming into the city, and as they're walking down the road, they see Jesus and they go, that's not how this is supposed to end. That's not how this story is supposed to play out. That can't be the Messiah. How could the Messiah be crucified? The Messiah is a general who's supposed to lead us against the Romans. He's supposed to be the great victorious general and king that God has sent to liberate his people. And yet there he is hanging naked on a cross. What do you do with that? You don't quite know if Jesus was the one to begin with, but now you're just going to go, well, I guess he wasn't. I guess he wasn't. He can't be, because that's not how the Messiah is supposed to end. The Messiah's life is supposed to end in victory and glory in old age or in battle, and we're supposed to be on the back of the victory that he leads us into. And yet here he is hanging on this cross. And so as the people are coming into the city, all of their expectations are completely deflated. There's no insurrection, there's no rising up, because, well, I guess he wasn't the one. I guess we were wrong. He never actually did say he was the Messiah. So maybe we just projected that. Maybe that was just a rumor. Whatever it was, I guess he wasn't the one. And so by hanging Jesus publicly, rather than just killing him behind closed doors, rather than just quietly executing him through the night, well, that's going to raise suspicions. That's going to raise doubts about, well, why did you kill him? We didn't see it. Where's the body? And that's going to cause problems. That's going to create more problems for the authorities. So to do it publicly, so that in a way that everybody's going to see it in the worst possible way, Romans only do this to the worst possible people. That's going to be a message enough. That naked, hanging, dying body, well, dead in some cases by the time some of them got there, that message alone is enough to pop the bubbles of expectation. But again, they put this sign above his head. What's this sign about? The King of the Jews. Well, I think there's three sort of layers to this. There's three levels to this sign. The first one is mockery. It's the Romans and it's the high priest mocking the very notion that this is the King of the Jews. This is the King of the Jews? Pfft, hardly. Look at him. How could this be the King of the Jews? It's just adding to the disgrace, adding to the shame of the message of this crucified pseudo so-called Messiah. Well, look how all of that turned out. This King of the Jews, right, what a joke. All of this is an absolute joke. So complete mockery. But also as a warning. Anybody else want to be the King of the Jews? Anybody else? Do I have any takers? Anybody else claiming to be the Messiah today? How would you, are you sure? Because, we've got another cross that we can put you up next to this guy. So like all of these punishments, it's a warning. This is what happens to anybody who claims to be the King of the Jews. You want to claim that mantle for yourself? Look at what the Romans are going to do to you. This is how it's going to end for you. So maybe think twice before, even in the future, just maybe think twice about the next time somebody wants to rise up and be the King of the Jews, this is how it's going to end up for you as well. So maybe just take this as a warning. Let's not do this again, shall we? But then I think there's a third and more profound and more important layer to this. And this is the sort of the Christian side of this story. We know how the story turns out. We know what the crucifixion means. And so what I see in this, I think, is something prophetic. Jesus, we know, we believe, is the Son of God. He is the one who inaugurates the new covenant. All of this new covenant, all of what the Jewish people have been expecting, this new covenant that they've been expecting, this renewal of the people, this God doing a brand new thing with a brand new king. We believe that was Jesus. We believe that took place beginning at the cross. We take this story seriously. We understand that he was in fact the Messiah. And what the crucifixion for those people that were there was a moment of deflation. But when we look back on it, we realize, actually, no, that was God's victory. That's how God inaugurated the new kingdom. That's how this new story began. God was in fact doing what the people were expecting. He just wasn't doing it the way that they were expecting him to do it. And that was the point of the story. And so what we see in the crucifixion is a prophetic message to us that in this new covenant, this is what it looks like. If you're going to enter into the new covenant, if you're going to be the people of God, it doesn't look like what you would expect. It looks the very opposite of what you would expect. You're not going to come in as some great victorious, look at me, God, I'm here, you're welcome, what do we get? No. You've got to come with humility. You've got to come and die to yourself. And so what Jesus is demonstrating on the cross is what it needs to look like for us. That's how this new covenant begins and how it continues and how ultimately it will end through Jesus' victory. And so we put in that sign above his head, that sign that says, the King of the Jews, it was testifying to the fact that he was, but just not in the way that you expected it. But when you understand the message, when you understand what the crucifixion actually symbolizes, you recognize, no, it wasn't a defeat. It wasn't a moment of deflation. What this was God's victory. This was God's victory over death, his victory over sin, and it was God's victory over the old world order. It was God instigating what was going to be this victorious new covenant that would bring about the redemption of humanity. And so in that way, Jesus was the King of the Jews. And that's what this sign was pointing towards. And so this is why we celebrate. This is what we are. This is why we identify at the core of our faith with Christ on the cross. But anyway, you know the rest of the story. I guess in most cases, that's why you're listening to this podcast. Now, I don't really quite know how to end something like this. It's been 14 weeks now of working through this. Only to say that I hope, thank you for hanging in there for all of this time. I hope this has been helpful. But we are sort of finishing up this one now. Won't be here next week. We're going to come back the week after. We're going to start a new series, which is something that I was going to do in this, actually through this series, but it would have made this whole thing 20 weeks maybe, I don't know. But what I'm going to do, we're going to come back in 2 weeks and we're going to start to look at the Gospels themselves and where all of these stories come from and just the reliability of the Gospels and what they're all about. But again, I hope this has been a helpful series for you. Again, thank you for hanging in there. And I look forward to seeing you again in 2 weeks. Have a great week. Bye-bye.